Antonio Jusivan Alves dos Reis ran a hand over his face, the weight of the plan settling in. Beneath him, Devenir Ribeiro and Jorge Luis worked tirelessly, their hands blistered from months of digging. Above them, inside the Banco Central, vault $70 million untraceable cash sat untouched. Until now. They weren't just criminals, they were masterminds of the most ambitious heist in Brazilian history. No alarms, no forced entry, no witnesses, just a tunnel, a plan, and the perfect crime. But even the best-laid plans have one fatal flaw: trust. And before it was over, that flaw would tear them apart. In the bustling city of Fortaleza, Brazil, a quiet transformation was taking place in a small rented storefront. At first glance, the building appeared unremarkable. A sign out front advertised a landscaping business, but there were no customers, no deliveries, and no real signs of activity. The neighbors barely noticed it. If anyone did happen to glance inside, they might have seen a few men moving equipment around or carrying bags of soil and tools. Nothing out of the ordinary for a business of that type. But beyond the surface, behind the walls and beneath the floors, something extraordinary was happening. This was no landscaping business. It was the cover for one of the most ambitious bank heists in history. A hand-picked team of criminals had assembled, each one bringing a specialized skill to the table. Some were experts in tunneling, others had engineering knowledge, and a few had ties to organized crime. They all had one thing in common. They wanted a piece of the millions sitting in the Banco Central's vault. The plan was as dangerous as it was brilliant. Instead of storming into the bank with weapons and masks, which would attract immediate police attention, they would take a different approach, one that required patience, precision, and months of preparation. They would dig a tunnel from the storefront, located 2 blocks away, directly beneath the vault of the Banco Central. If successful, they would bypass all the bank's security systems, avoid triggering alarms, and vanish without leaving a trace. The mastermind behind the operation was meticulous. He knew that mistakes would be costly, and he demanded discipline from everyone involved. The first step was securing the perfect location. The chosen property had to be close enough to the bank to make tunneling possible, but far enough to avoid suspicion. The storefront had been rented under a false identity, paid for in cash, and furnished just enough to appear legitimate. Once the lease was signed, the real work began. They started by digging straight down, carefully avoiding underground pipes and electrical cables. The deeper they went, the greater the risk. If the tunnel collapsed, they would be buried alive. If a neighbor or city worker noticed anything unusual, the entire plan could fall apart before it even began. To minimize detection, they removed soil in small amounts, packing it into bags and transporting it out of the building under the guise of landscaping work. The process was slow, exhausting, and dangerous, but they were determined. As the weeks passed, the tunnel began to take shape. It had to be long enough to reach the bank, sturdy enough to support the weight of the ground above, and discreet enough to avoid suspicion. Wooden beams reinforced the walls, preventing cave-ins. Electrical wiring was installed to provide lighting. A ventilation system was set up to ensure they could breathe as they worked underground. The more complex the tunnel became, the more it resembled something out of a military operation rather than a simple bank robbery. The men worked in shifts, digging through the night and resting during the day to maintain their strength. They used shovels, pickaxes, and even power tools when necessary, muffling the noise to avoid drawing attention. Every inch of progress was carefully measured, making sure they were on track to reach their target without error. They consulted blueprints, studied underground maps, and double-checked calculations. There was no room for mistakes. The deeper they went, the more real the plan became. What had started as an idea was now a physical structure, inching closer to one of the most secure locations in Brazil. They knew that once they reached the vault, there would be no turning back. Months of labor would come down to a single moment, a single break into the bank floor. If they had miscalculated, if they had chosen the wrong spot, if the bank security had an unexpected countermeasure, everything would collapse in an instant. But doubts were pushed aside. The closer they got, the more their confidence grew. Inside that vault was more than money. It was freedom, a way out of their old lives. Some of them had been small-time criminals before this, involved in minor thefts or fraud. Others had never committed a crime before. But now they were all part of something far bigger, something that could make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. After 3 months of backbreaking work, the tunnel was complete. It stretched 256 feet from the rented storefront to directly beneath the Banco Central's vault. The only thing standing between them and the money was a concrete floor. They had done everything right so far, but the most critical part of the plan was yet to come. They would have only one chance to break into the vault without triggering an alarm. One mistake could mean getting caught or worse, walking away empty-handed. The night of August 5, 2005 was one of absolute stillness. The streets of Fortaleza carried their usual late-night quiet, with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional barking of a stray dog. Inside the abandoned storefront, a group of men stood in tense anticipation. Months of work had led to this moment. The tunnel stretched beneath them, reinforced, wired for light, and meticulously measured to emerge directly beneath the vault of the Banco Central. Now the only thing separating them from the millions inside was a thick layer of steel-reinforced concrete. The plan had been methodically tested. They knew exactly how deep the floor of the vault was, how much concrete they needed to break through, and what tools to use. They had acquired heavy-duty drills, specialized cutting equipment, and even makeshift silencers to muffle the noise. But even with all these precautions, the risk was enormous. If their calculations were wrong, if the floor was thicker than expected, or if an unexpected security measure was in place, the entire plan could collapse. One by one, the men descended into the tunnel, moving carefully in the confined space. The air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of damp earth and sweat. Their hands, calloused from months of digging, now grasped tools instead of shovels. Each movement was deliberate. There was no room for panic, no time for hesitation. They worked in shifts, knowing that exhaustion could lead to mistakes. The first breakthrough came after hours of drilling. The sound of concrete cracking filled the narrow space, sending vibrations through the tunnel. The men paused, listening for any sign that an alarm had been triggered. Silence. Encouraged, they pressed forward, chipping away at the barrier with controlled precision. The process was slow, agonizing even. Every inch gained brought them closer to their fortune, but also increased the risk of discovery. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a small opening appeared in the vault floor. A rush of cool air filtered into the tunnel, carrying the sterile scent of bank storage. They had done it. The concrete had given way, revealing a darkened space above them. One of the men climbed through the hole first, his breath steady but his pulse racing. The vault was just as they had envisioned. A massive room filled with towering stacks of banknotes. The realization of their success settled in. They were inside. The next phase had to be executed with speed and precision. The bank's vault held cash used for economic regulation, meaning much of it was unregistered, free from serial tracking. They focused on these stacks, working quickly, but without frenzy. Each duffel bag was filled methodically, ensuring they took as much as possible while still being able to carry it through the tunnel. Despite the weight of the cash, they worked in near silence, their training paying off. They had practiced this moment, anticipated the adrenaline rush, and disciplined themselves to avoid reckless mistakes. Time was their enemy. Though they had planned the break-in for the weekend, knowing the bank wouldn't open until Monday, they couldn't risk staying too long. One by one, the men disappeared back into the tunnel, dragging their fortune with them. The final step was sealing the hole in the vault floor. Using a pre-prepared mix of cement and debris, they patched up the entry point as best as they could. It wouldn't hold up under close inspection, but with luck, it would delay discovery long enough for them to vanish. By the time the last man emerged from the tunnel, the storefront looked as unremarkable as ever. There were no alarms blaring, no security guards rushing in. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. The final task was covering their tracks. The tunnel was abandoned, the tools left behind, and the men dispersed with their share of the cash. Their plan had worked. They had just pulled off one of the most daring heists in history, and no one even knew it had happened. Monday morning at the Banco Central in Fortaleza started like any other day. Employees arrived, security staff checked in, and business operations resumed as usual. The vault, secured behind thick steel doors and concrete walls, was assumed to be untouched. There had been no alarm triggers, no reports of suspicious activity, and no forced entry. It wasn't until an employee entered the vault to access stored cash reserves that the first sign of something unusual appeared. Stacks of banknotes that should have been neatly arranged were missing. At first, there was confusion. Perhaps an accounting mistake, a miscalculation in storage. But as the employee stepped further into the vault, the realization struck hard. An enormous amount of cash was gone. What should have been millions in Brazilian reals had disappeared without a trace. Panic set in as bank officials scrambled to assess the situation. Security footage was reviewed immediately, but it showed nothing suspicious. There were no unauthorized entries, no masked criminals storming the bank, no signs of anyone having breached the building. The vault doors were intact. The only possible explanations were either a major internal theft or something far more complex. When police arrived, they conducted a meticulous sweep of the vault. It was during this inspection that one officer noticed something peculiar on the floor. A faint but noticeable patch of cement, slightly different in texture from the surrounding surface, drew immediate suspicion. Officers knocked on the area and listened carefully. The sound was different, hollow. Something was beneath the vault. A few hours later, with tools in hand, investigators chipped away at the suspicious section of flooring. What they found was, beyond anything they had expected, a tunnel, carefully dug and reinforced, stretched into darkness below. A wave of disbelief swept through the investigation team. The sheer scale of what had been accomplished was staggering. Someone had bypassed all of the bank's external security measures, dug their way under one of the most secure locations in the country, and vanished with millions in cash, all without leaving a single alarm tripped. News of the robbery spread like wildfire. Within hours, headlines across Brazil were dominated by reports of the audacious heist. People marveled at the precision of the criminals, while law enforcement agencies scrambled to piece together what had happened. How had no one noticed? How long had they been digging? Who was behind such a sophisticated operation? Police followed the tunnel's path, carefully maneuvering through its narrow, claustrophobic space. Eventually, they reached the other end. A vacant storefront with a sign for a landscaping business. It was the first major lead in the case. The rented property had been the perfect cover, allowing the criminals to remove dirt and transport equipment without suspicion. Inside, investigators found scattered construction tools, wooden beams, and traces of soil matching the material beneath the bank. But the criminals were gone, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell of their operation. Detectives immediately turned their focus to the rental agreement, searching for anyone linked to the property. They identified a man who had signed the lease under a false name, but tracking him down proved difficult. Fake identities, cash transactions, and the lack of security footage meant that the criminals had thought ahead. The investigation hit a frustrating roadblock. Desperate for leads, authorities widened their search, looking for any unusual activity in the city. A crime of this scale required skilled labor, financial backing, and careful coordination. It wasn't long before whispers from the criminal underworld started surfacing. Some individuals had suddenly come into large amounts of money, while others had vanished without explanation. The first major breakthrough came when police received an anonymous tip. A man suspected of being connected to the heist had been found murdered. This discovery changed everything. The heist had been carried out with discipline and precision, but now the group was turning on itself. Greed, fear, and paranoia were unraveling the perfect crime. The question was no longer just about who had committed the robbery, but who would be left standing by the time the case was solved. The murder of one of the suspected criminals sent a ripple of panic through the investigation. What had started as a seemingly perfect crime was now unraveling. Someone within the group had decided that loose ends needed to be cut, and that meant more people could be in danger. For the police, this was both a complication and an opportunity. If the criminals were turning on each other, it was only a matter of time before someone made a mistake. The first real lead came when investigators tracked down financial transactions tied to known criminals. Suspicion grew around a group of individuals who had recently come into large amounts of money, purchasing expensive cars, jewelry, and properties well beyond their usual means. The authorities quietly began monitoring them, looking for connections to the tunnel and the stolen money. The pressure intensified when police intercepted phone conversations between suspects. Though none of them directly admitted to the crime, the calls were full of vague discussions about problems and people talking too much. It was clear that paranoia had set in. With such an enormous sum of money involved, trust among the gang members had begun to erode. One by one, the police started making arrests. At first, the men they captured refused to talk, believing that silence was their best chance at keeping their freedom and their money. But as investigators applied pressure, threatening long prison sentences, offering deals for cooperation, cracks began to form in the once tight organization. Some of the lower-ranking members, fearing for their lives more than prison time, started revealing details. The mastermind behind the heist was soon identified: Antonio Yusivan Alves dos Reis. A career criminal with a history of fraud and robbery, he had orchestrated the entire operation, from selecting the tunnel location to assembling the perfect team. He had recruited experienced diggers, engineers, and planners, ensuring that every step of the heist was executed with precision. But what he hadn't accounted for was the power of greed. With millions of dollars suddenly in their hands, some members of the gang had been unable to resist flaunting their wealth. One suspect had purchased luxury vehicles in cash, drawing unwanted attention. Another had made large real estate investments under his own name, a move that investigators quickly linked to the stolen money. The more they spent, the more they exposed themselves. Police also uncovered details about the internal conflicts within the gang. Some members had received less than they expected from the split, leading to resentment. Others had tried to disappear with their share, breaking the original agreement to keep a low profile. The murder that had initially tipped off authorities turned out to be an act of betrayal within the group. One of the criminals had attempted to keep a larger portion of the money for himself and had paid the ultimate price. As police made more arrests, they recovered portions of the stolen cash, though a significant amount remained missing. Some of the money had been laundered through businesses, hidden in offshore accounts, or smuggled out of the country. Investigators believed that several members of the gang had successfully escaped with their shares, vanishing into different parts of Brazil or even beyond. Despite the progress in solving the case, frustration lingered. The mastermind was still on the run, and with him, millions of dollars remained unaccounted for. The authorities knew that catching him wouldn't just be about police work, it would require patience, waiting for the moment when his luck finally ran out. As the investigation pressed forward, the once carefully planned heist had turned into a chaotic downfall. The criminals had outsmarted the bank's security, fooled the police in the beginning, and even managed to disappear into the shadows for a time. But in the end, the one thing they couldn't escape was their own greed. Months passed, but the hunt for Antonio Yusivan Alves dos Reis and the remaining stolen millions continued. The Banco Central heist had become one of the biggest stories in Brazil, capturing the public's imagination. How had a group of criminals outwitted the system, digging for months beneath a heavily secured vault and escaping without setting off a single alarm? More importantly, where had they gone? While many members of the gang had already been arrested, the authorities knew the job wasn't finished. Millions were still missing, and the mastermind had yet to be caught. The police focused on tracing financial movements, monitoring relatives, and questioning known associates. They believed that Antonio Yusivan, also known as the Doctor, due to his intelligence and methodical planning, was still in the country, hiding, waiting, and possibly planning his next move. Then, a breakthrough. A confidential informant tipped off the authorities about a man living under a false identity in São Paulo. He rarely left his residence, avoided public interactions, and conducted all business through intermediaries. Surveillance teams were deployed, watching his movements and waiting for confirmation. After weeks of careful observation, they made their move. In a swift operation, law enforcement raided the property and arrested Antonio Husivan. His attempt to change his identity and disappear had failed. But even with his capture, the mystery of the missing money remained. Investigators pressed him for information, hoping to recover the millions still unaccounted for. But he refused to talk. His silence left authorities frustrated, and despite their best efforts, a significant portion of the stolen money was never found. Meanwhile, other key figures in the heist were tracked down, including those who had fled the country. Some had attempted to launder their stolen fortunes, but law enforcement agencies were relentless. The net continued to tighten, and with each arrest, more details about the operation emerged. But the most baffling aspect of the case remained unsolved. Where was the rest of the money? Estimates suggested that over $30 million had vanished. Some believed it was hidden underground, buried in remote locations or concealed within legitimate businesses. Others speculated that some of the criminals had successfully fled to foreign countries with their shares, living under new identities. Despite the arrests and recoveries, the heist remained legendary. It had been planned with extraordinary precision, executed with patience, and almost succeeded entirely. The criminals had bypassed the most advanced security systems of the time, proving that sometimes the most sophisticated crimes don't require weapons, just intelligence, determination, and the ability to stay quiet. In the years that followed, the Banco Central burglary became the subject of documentaries, books, and endless speculation. The tunnel itself, an engineering feat constructed in secret, was studied as a testament to the lengths criminals could go to achieve their goals. But for those who had been caught, the reality was much harsher. Long prison sentences awaited them, and whatever dreams they had of living as rich men had crumbled. Yet, the greatest mystery of all still lingers. Somewhere, whether buried beneath the earth, locked away in offshore accounts, or sitting in the hands of unknown criminals, a fortune from the Banco Central heist remains missing, and for those who believe they got away with it, the risk will never fade. The fear of discovery, of an unexpected knock on the door, of a single mistake unraveling their new lives, that will always remain. The perfect heist had come so close to success, but in the end, greed and betrayal had ensured that even the most carefully planned crimes can never truly be perfect.